Hello, welcome and thank you for watching this video. We're going to take up where we left off in the previous video. The reasons that I have stated in the videos are the reasons why our government, under a previous president's administration, they were supposedly elected in 2000 and again in 2004, tried to misrepresent their legislation for our forest lands and for our children's education, why they misrepresented the so-called benefits of their tax cut, why they shamelessly used the tragedy of September 11th to reduce and even remove far too many of our civil liberties, which, once lost, are difficult to regain, why they spoke at veterans rallies while cutting benefits for veterans, and why they misrepresented and changed several times the reasons for going to war in Iraq, where more than 4,300 fine young Americans from the military lost their lives, and thousands more have been injured, along with tens of thousands of Iraqis. As if all of these things that they did were not more than enough, that was also the reason why they did not want to have government employees doing jobs normally and historically handled by government employees, if those same jobs could be privatized, meaning that they wanted to turn those jobs over to the private sector, where the first priority is never the product or service being provided, but must be the bottom line, profit, first, last, and always. We'll have more discussion about privatization a bit later. Frankly, similar practices have been carried out under numerous administrations prior to that. I had false hopes that our country and its new leaders, elected in 2008 and again in 2012, would make every effort to make its people and their welfare a higher priority than this bottom line. But the current power structure is now so built into our system of government that many of those who were formerly in political control in the previous administration still wield great influence, and along with other politicians, pundits, and paid lobbyists, they have successfully prevented for years millions of people in this country who had no health insurance from receiving adequate and affordable health insurance. And this was simply in order to allow the health insurance industry to continue to increase their profits at the expense of the people's health. Now, the Health Insurance Act, the Affordable Care Act, was passed, but it was so watered down by the time it was passed that it should be replaced eventually, or perhaps even gradually, but certainly eventually, by a single-payer system. Now, all of that I've just described is only one of the tragedies resulting from the way things were then and the way too many of them still are today. Sadly, the healthcare legislation, as I said, that was finally passed and is now implemented just isn't as effective as it should be. Or it should have a more affordable price tag for consumers compared to a so-called government option that was vetoed by the opposition party, or a single-payer system, which is really what is needed, for it would be far more superior in many respects. Why hasn't the United States joined the rest of the civilized, industrialized nations by providing low-cost, adequate health insurance, and thereby making adequate and truly affordable health care available to all of our citizens at a reasonably low cost, or even at no cost? Why also have we not taken so many other important steps to help jobs, education, infrastructure, and so many other important matters in the way that other countries have done? Because far too often it might take dollars out of the bank accounts of those who already have more money than they and their children and their grandchildren can ever spend. Put very simply, it is all about money and power, and about keeping the money and power right where they are today, while keeping us dependent on whatever crumbs they allow to trickle down from time to time. Let's now consider another aspect of this long-standing state of affairs. You need to be aware, if you don't know already, that a significant majority of the ultra-wealthy elite realized long ago that the way to accomplish their goals is for all of them or their representatives and agents to come together figuratively, if not literally, by one means or another and work together for the same goals. Many years ago they began in great earnest to step up the pace of their ongoing but previously more subtle efforts to do whatever they felt was necessary to discredit or otherwise defeat those who disagreed with them or who were opposing their candidates for political office, and to make their agenda look and sound more palatable to the voters. About 1981 they began to do these things much more openly and aggressively than had been done in the past. There have been and are still very large numbers of people who are working in a very purposeful manner for that same common goal, to implement what seems to be their shared idea to make their very conservative agenda the law of the land in America. It appears to be their intent to have the country's political pendulum continue to swing in their direction, meaning to the far right, ad infinitum. It then seems to be their idea that the pendulum will never be allowed to swing back the other way. The recent Supreme Court decisions that gave corporations and the very wealthy the right to spend seemingly unlimited funds in order to elect candidates favorable to themselves, the ultra-wealthy elite, and or to prevent the election of someone unfavorable to themselves, is another example of what I have been describing. Those in the corporate structure and the ultra-wealthy, who are so often heavily invested in the success of the corporate structure, have in some cases almost unlimited funds, and have now been given the opportunity to literally buy the elections when it suits their needs. Corporations have no soul and are not people. Neither should money be equated to speech. They are not the same. And if money is allowed to be equated to speech, that means you can't say anything if you don't have the money. You're not going to be able to say nearly as much, at least, as the one who does have the money. And the more money that you have, the more that you can say and be heard. At this point, just for the sake of clarity and for those who may not know, I'm going to point out that in the United States there exists the political left, generally Democrats, and the political right, generally Republicans, as well as those who consider themselves to be independent of leaning in either direction to any significant degree. Around this planet on the left are varying degrees of liberalism, which most of you know about. And as one moves further to the left, there is socialism, and finally communism. On the right, there are varying degrees of conservatism, and as one moves further to the right, there is increasing militarism, a police state, and finally fascism, or that which was practiced by Hitler and the Nazis. I trust that this will provide a stronger foundation from which to consider the facts covered here. Now let's take some time to delve even further into what those who are in financial control want to see happen. We'll do this in order to help you decide whether you want to be aligned with them or not. We can begin by asking some questions, and you can consider what you believe the answers should be. Do you feel that everyone who can benefit should have equal access to a good education, including college, and that if they cannot afford the cost of that education, they should still receive the education regardless? Do you feel that everyone should have equal access and opportunity for a job with a living wage and reasonable benefits? Do you feel that everyone should have the right to adequate medical insurance and quality medical care, even if they are unable to afford those things? Do you feel that everyone should have the right to decent housing so that they can make a home for themselves and their families? Do you believe that everyone who does their best to work hard and play by the rules and be a good citizen should have the right to a decent life? If you answered yes to those questions, then you're not aligned with what too many of the ultra-wealthy want to see in this country, and I congratulate you. For some of you who may have been able to answer no to one or more of these questions, perhaps you feel that since you had to work hard for all that you have, then why should others be helped instead of having to do the same as you did? I commend all of you who have worked hard and have something to show for it. But perhaps you should ask yourself whether it might have been different for you if you had experienced a great deal of sickness during your life, or if you had a disability, or if your upbringing had been other than what it was, or even if the color of your skin had been different. I'm not unaware that some of you may have done well despite such obstacles, but let us all hope that if you're one of those persons who have a lack of compassion for those who are even less fortunate, that those who lack such compassion will not somehow have taken away that which they now have. I tell you now that in the eyes of Almighty God, we are our brother's keeper. There was no doubt left regarding this fact when the New Testament of the Judeo-Christian Bible related to us the story of the example of the Good Samaritan. The great majority of citizens who align themselves with certain politicians, and I mean those politicians who use divisive and unfruitful policies, usually profess to believe in all of these things just mentioned above about the needs of the less fortunate, And perhaps of those who truly do, hopefully most or all of them will realign their thinking to follow those politicians who have more inclusive policies. Policies that consider the needs of all the people. In my observations, however, regardless of which party is in power, although I'm not trying to say that there are no differences, they may voice policies that seem different, but they essentially seem over the years to have had the same results. No universal health care freely available to all those who need it. No higher education freely available for all those who need it. No solution to the homeless problem. No decent minimum wage. Severe lack of good-paying jobs. And that's just to mention a few reasons for my conclusion. They, meaning those of both political parties, will announce and begin projects supposedly designed to help such problems with great fanfare. But the politicians from both sides will almost always weaken the legislation and or underfund such projects significantly to the point that very little, if anything, worthwhile gets accomplished. Nevertheless, they want it to at least appear to the public that they are doing their best to make a positive difference, or they will approach it in a way that will significantly favor their most affluent and wealthy constituency, or they may do both. In addition, those who are conservative usually prefer to privatize government functions so some corporation can make a profit from it by overcharging the taxpayers and then cutting back later on services in order to make continuing and even higher profits. There have been efforts in the past to privatize the country's air traffic control system. They even privatized the new drug benefits in Medicare Part D. In fact, it was set up so that Medicare was not even allowed to negotiate with the drug companies in order to try to save on the cost of drugs. How crazy is that? In addition, like the 2 wars on the tax cut, there was no provision made in the legislation to provide funding to pay for the project, because they don't want to raise taxes, even on those who will not be hurt by it. As a result, in the case of Part D of Medicare, this approach would give as much as possible of the project to private business interests. In theory, there should be nothing wrong with privatization, but in reality, there are at least 2 big reasons why that is not always the best approach. The first reason is that when privatization is there, the bottom line must by necessity become the biggest priority, and not the product or service being provided, and more importantly, not the people to whom the product or service is being provided. In addition, for the corporate world, the bottom line must always continue to improve. So there's always the incentive to either raise prices, reduce the labor costs by somehow lowering the wages on existing employees, or using robotics, or even by using the labor in a country where labor costs are much cheaper. We all know the tragic results of that. Another option that's often used is to cheapen the product or reduce the service, or to do all of the above. By design, it is the nature of corporations that they and their upper management have no choice except to follow the creed that requires them to bow down and worship at the altar of the almighty dollar. Even the word capital, the foundation or root of the term capitalism, means money. And as stated in an earlier video, if capital means money, then we literally live now under a system of moneyism. How does that make you feel? To live in a system described as the greatest in the world. Remember again, who told us that the love of money is the root of all evil? He also told us, as I said earlier, that we cannot serve two masters, both God and mammon. Are you beginning to see the light just a little? Any talk about the possibility of future privatization, even partial privatization for other Medicare benefits or for Social Security, should raise a red flag for anyone who in years past happily changed to an HMO for their health insurance because they were told that it would be so much better for them. We all know what has since happened. A great many people have been deprived of crucial medical treatment because it might unfavorably affect the bottom line, which is always the first priority with the corporate structure, a structure which has such a disproportionately high level of influence in the United States and around the world. You should also know that school vouchers can be used, and probably are in many instances, as a veiled way of having the taxpayers help pay for the private education of children whose parents perhaps don't want them to have to go to public school with the average student, or perhaps even with minorities. So they send them to private, often religious schools. Now don't misunderstand, no one is questioning the right of citizens to send their children to a private school, whether or not the reasons have to do with religious beliefs. There is something wrong, however, when the taxpayers are being told to pay part of the bill, and when those lost funds threaten, as this does, to hurt the public school system, taking away needed funds and thereby making it less effective. Speaking of the schools, let's talk a bit more about that subject. Our public school system should have a consistency from state to state, and should not be subject to the whims and prejudices of each and every local school board. In addition, our public schools today need to be changed so that our best teachers are among the highest paid of professions. That would result in all the people best qualified for teaching to be standing in line to provide the best possible education for our country's children. Remember that these same children are the young individuals who will someday hold in their hands the future of this country and of the world. With reasonable planning and forethought, our public schools could and should be brought to the point where no parent would even consider sending their children to any other school than the nearest public school, because that would be where their children would receive the best education. That's not being done, and the people of this country should be demanding to know why. The previous administration of George W. Bush was talking about providing big funding for education, just as they promised to do before the election of 2004. Nevertheless, the fact of the matter is that they, over the years, did not fund the school system to the needed levels, and instead they seem to have more of a tendency to cut the funding for public education and numerous other programs in order to provide tax cuts which give the most benefit to the most affluent and wealthy among us so they can continue to send their children to the very best of the private schools. The people of this country should have insisted that they be told why, and they should also have insisted on appropriate change to correct that situation. The current administration, elected in 2008 and again in 2012, appears to want to improve these problems that the public schools face, and to do so in a significant way. We shall watch to see what happens. However, you should be aware that as long as Grover Norquist and others like him who refuse to allow taxes to be raised on those who will not be hurt by higher taxes, keep the funds from being available to do what needs to be done to the schools. The previous administration, elected in 2000 and again in 2004, brought the country to its knees financially in 2008 through greed, combined with a purposeful lack of oversight and a purposeful lack of regulation that began even before the year 2000. So there appears to be very little left in the way of funding for the current public school system or anything else. These facts and the obstruction of those in the opposing party have left the United States and much of the world in very sad shape. Again, thank you for watching. I invite you now to watch the next video and subsequent videos in this series. Again, thank you.